The world awoke to headlines that seemed torn from the pages of a political thriller. In Tel Aviv, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had stepped before the cameras with a grim expression, his words reverberating across continents within minutes. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has 48 hours to vacate his position as leader of Burkina Faso. Netanyahu declared, his voice sharp, deliberate, and unyielding. He must either step down peacefully, surrender authority, or face consequences that he cannot withstand. The press conference was brief, but its implications were seismic. Israel, a nation with global intelligence reach and a reputation for decisive action, had just placed a direct ultimatum upon a young African leader who symbolized defiance against Western domination. For decades, African leaders had been pressured, overthrown, or even assassinated for daring to chart independent courses. But never before had the threat been laid out so openly, so brazenly, and with such a ticking clock attached. Within an hour, international news outlets exploded with analysis. CNN ran the headline, Netanyahu's 48-hour ultimatum shakes Africa. Al Jazeera countered with, Burkina Faso's Traoré targeted in global power struggle. French outlets, long critical of Traoré's anti-colonial stance, suggested the ultimatum was inevitable. Russian and Chinese state media, however, condemned Netanyahu's statement as neo-colonial arrogance. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the ultimatum hit like a thunderclap. The sun had barely risen when radio stations and street corner televisions replayed Netanyahu's words again and again. Crowds gathered in markets, universities, and mosques, debating in heated tones. Some were fearful. Israel's global influence was not to be underestimated. But many more were angry, their voices rising in unison. We will not surrender. Traoré is our pride. Captain Ibrahim Traoré himself received the news in his modest office at the presidential palace. Unlike the grand, gilded halls of Western leaders, his workspace was simple: wooden furniture, maps of Africa on the walls, and the ever-present Burkinabe flag behind his desk. His closest advisors sat stunned as the ultimatum was played on a laptop screen. One minister whispered, Monsieur le President, this is war. Traoré leaned back, his expression calm, almost defiant. This is not war, he replied softly. This is fear. Netanyahu fears what Burkina Faso represents. We are the spark that could ignite a fire across Africa. The morning after Netanyahu's ultimatum, Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared before the cameras in Ouagadougou. The presidential hall was filled with soldiers, journalists, and ministers. But the energy in the room came not from the chandeliers above, but from the young leader himself. He wore his usual camouflage uniform, beret tilted slightly on his head, a symbol that he remained first and foremost a soldier of the people. His eyes were steady, his jaw firm, and when he began to speak, his voice carried the weight of a continent. My brothers and sisters of Burkina Faso, my fellow Africans, he began. His words broadcast live across radio, television, and social media platforms. Yesterday, the Prime Minister of Israel stood before the world and demanded that I abandon the leadership you entrusted to me. He gave me 48 hours to surrender or to flee. He believes that a young African soldier can be frightened into silence. The hall erupted in murmurs, anger rippling through the crowd. Traoré raised his hand, calming the room. But I tell you this, Burkina Faso will not kneel. We will not surrender our sovereignty. We will not abandon the dream of independence. This ultimatum is not aimed at me alone. It is aimed at every African who dares to dream of freedom. It is aimed at every farmer, every student, every mother and father who believe their destiny should not be dictated by foreign powers. Applause thundered through the chamber. Soldiers slammed their fists against their chests in salute. Ministers rose to their feet. The young president's words were not merely defiance. They were a call to arms, a reminder that the future of Burkina Faso was not negotiable. On the streets outside, giant screens replayed his speech to crowds packed shoulder to shoulder. People waved Burkinabe flags, chanting, Traoré, Traoré, Burkina Faso is not for sale. Vendors abandoned their stalls to join the demonstrations. University students marched with banners reading, Hands off our sovereignty. For decades, African capitals had known fear at the first sign of Western threats. But something was different now. This time, fear was replaced by rage, by hope, by a sense that perhaps, at last, Africa was ready to stand united. That evening, Traoré convened a private meeting with his top generals. Maps of the Sahel region covered the table, and intelligence reports lay stacked in folders. General Umar Konate, head of Burkina Faso's defense forces, spoke first. "Mr. President, Israel does not make idle threats. They have allies everywhere. Intelligence, drones, cyber capabilities. If they decide to act, we must be ready." Traoré nodded slowly. "Then we will be ready. We are not alone. The people are with us, and Africa is watching. If Israel believes we will crumble, let them test our resolve." His words carried no bravado, no empty slogans. They were simple, clear, and filled with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed history had placed him in this moment for a reason. As the hours ticked down from Netanyahu's ultimatum, Africa itself began to stir. What had first appeared to be a threat directed solely at Burkina Faso quickly spread like wildfire across the continent. In Bamako, Mali's capital, thousands gathered in Independence Square waving both Malian and Burkinabe flags. A speaker stood atop a makeshift stage, shouting into a microphone. "An attack on Traoré is an attack on Africa. If Burkina Faso falls, tomorrow they will come for Mali, for Niger, for Congo. We must stand as one." The crowd roared in agreement, chanting, "A freak uni! A freak uni! United Africa! United Africa!" In Dakar, Senegalese students marched through university campuses, carrying portraits of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso who decades earlier had fought against imperialism. The symbolism was clear to them. Traoré was the modern heir of Sankara's vision, and Netanyahu's ultimatum was not just a political maneuver but a direct assault on Sankara's legacy. Even in South Africa, thousands of miles away, solidarity protests filled the streets of Johannesburg. Protesters held signs reading, "Hands off Burkina Faso," and "Africa will not surrender." Local radio hosts declared that this was a turning point, that Africa's patience with foreign domination had reached its breaking point. Governments, too, were compelled to respond. Mali, Niger, and Guinea issued a joint statement condemning Netanyahu's ultimatum as an unacceptable interference in the sovereignty of an African nation. Chad's interim president gave a fiery speech, declaring, "If Burkina Faso is forced to its knees, we will all rise in rebellion. Africa is no longer a playground for outside powers." In Addis Ababa, home to the African Union headquarters, diplomats worked around the clock. A confidential report circulated among member states warned, "If we fail to support Burkina Faso now, Africa will fracture under the weight of external coercion." Discussions of a joint defense pact, long a dream of Pan-Africanists, suddenly took on new urgency. Meanwhile, social media became a digital battlefield. Hashtags like #StandWithTraoré, #AfricaUnited, and #Burkina Faso resists trended across Twitter and TikTok. Young Africans created viral videos linking Netanyahu's ultimatum to centuries of colonial exploitation, declaring, "The same powers who stole our gold and diamonds now want to steal our independence. We say no." What had begun as a local standoff was rapidly evolving into something far greater, a continental awakening. Netanyahu's ultimatum, intended to intimidate one man, had inadvertently galvanized hundreds of millions. For the first time in generations, Africa seemed to be moving not as isolated states, but as one body, one voice, one rising tide. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré was briefed on the wave of support flooding in from across the continent. He sat silently for a moment, absorbing the gravity of it all. Then he spoke to his advisors. "Netanyahu thinks he gave me 48 hours. But in truth, he has given Africa 48 hours to decide its destiny. Will we be forever divided, or will we finally stand as one?" The room fell silent. The meaning was clear. The ultimatum was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about Africa itself. as Africa rallied behind Burkina Faso. The rest of the world could not remain silent. Netanyahu's ultimatum had pushed the crisis onto the global stage, and in every capital, diplomats scrambled to define their nation's stance. In Washington, the White House press secretary gave a carefully worded statement. The United States supports stability and democratic governance in Africa. She said, avoiding Netanyahu's name. We urge restraint on all sides. Yet behind closed doors, US officials made no secret of their sympathy for Israel's position. One leaked memo from the State Department revealed, Traoré's policies threaten Western strategic interests in the Sahel, while open support for Israel's ultimatum may inflame anti-American sentiment in Africa. We must prepare contingency plans to contain Burkina Faso. In Paris, President Emmanuel Macron faced a storm of criticism. France, long resented for its colonial past in West Africa, found itself in an impossible position. Officially, Macron condemned any threats to African sovereignty. But privately, French military officials expressed frustration that Traoré's defiance was inspiring resistance movements across Francophone Africa, eroding France's influence. If Burkina Faso resists and wins, one French general warned, the entire Francophone sphere may slip out of our hands. Meanwhile in Moscow, Vladimir Putin seized the opportunity with relish. Appearing on state television, he declared, "What we see is the arrogance of Western powers, threatening young nations who seek independence. Russia stands with Burkina Faso, as we have always stood with nations who fight for sovereignty." Russian cargo planes were rumored to be preparing shipments of food aid, fuel, and possibly even weapons for Ouagadougou. In Beijing, the Chinese Foreign Ministry struck a more cautious tone, but the intent was clear. China opposes the interference of any state in the internal affairs of another. The spokesman said, analysts speculated that China, with its vast economic projects in Africa, saw Traoré as a useful counterweight to Western dominance. If Burkina Faso stood firm, China's narrative of a multipolar world would gain strength. At the United Nations in New York, the Security Council held an emergency session. Israel's ambassador demanded international backing for Netanyahu's ultimatum, describing Traoré as a destabilizing radical aligned with hostile powers. The Russian ambassador shot back, calling Israel's threat an act of international banditry. China echoed the criticism, while Western allies of Israel struggled to maintain a united front. The session ended in deadlock, with no resolution passed. Global media mirrored the split. Western outlets framed the crisis as a confrontation between a rogue soldier and a responsible global leader. African and Middle Eastern media painted the opposite picture, a courageous African leader standing against imperialist bullying. Social media users worldwide chose sides, their feeds flooded with fiery memes, viral speeches, and conspiracy theories about what might unfold when the 48 hours expired. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré's advisors briefed him on the shifting international scene. One aide summarized, "Mr. President, the West prepares to isolate us, but the East sees us as a symbol. The world has split in two, and we are at the center." Traoré remained calm. "Good," he said simply. "Let them choose. History does not wait for cowards." As the second day of Netanyahu's ultimatum dawned, the streets of Ouagadougou transformed into a living sea of defiance. What began as small gatherings outside government buildings swelled into a tidal wave of humanity. From the narrow alleys of old neighborhoods to the wide boulevards of the capital, men, women, and children poured into the open, their voices rising like thunder. The central square, Place de la Revolution, became the heart of the resistance. Tens of thousands packed the square, waving Burkinabe flags high above their heads. Mothers carried infants wrapped in the red, green, and gold colors of the nation. Old men, leaning on wooden canes, lifted their fists in silent solidarity. Young men climbed lampposts and rooftops to hang banners that read, "Burkina Faso will never surrender." A group of drummers set up in the middle of the crowd, their hands pounding rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the entire nation. The music spread like wildfire, and soon chants rose to match the drums. "Traoré, Traoré, Africa is proud of you. We will die before we kneel." The chants rolled like waves across the square, each one louder than the last, until it seemed the city itself was roaring. Local radio stations broadcast live from the square, their reporters nearly drowned out by the sound of the people. One announcer shouted into his microphone, "Listen, world. This is Ouagadougou. This is the voice of Africa refusing to bow." In the neighborhoods, artists painted murals overnight, covering blank walls with images of Traoré standing tall against foreign powers. Street poets recited verses about Thomas Sankara, weaving his legacy with Traoré's defiance. Vendors handed out free water to protesters, while families brought food to sustain those who refused to leave the square. As the hours passed, the demonstration spread beyond the capital. In Bobo-Dioulasso, the country's second-largest city, tens of thousands flooded the streets, waving not only Burkinabe flags but also those of Mali, Niger, and Guinea. Farmers left their fields to march. Students abandoned classrooms. Churches and mosques rang with prayers for strength. One particularly powerful moment came when a group of school children, no older than 10, stood on the steps of a government building, holding a giant banner made of cloth stitched together from scraps. The words painted across it in bold red letters read, "Our future is not for sale." International media broadcast images of the protests worldwide. To some in the West, it was chaos. To others, it was courage. To Africans watching from abroad, it was a moment of pride they had long awaited. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré watched the footage in silence. His generals stood behind him, visibly moved by the sight of their people rising in defiance. Finally, Traoré spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "With people like this, we cannot lose. Even if they destroy us, we will live forever in history." The 48 hours were not yet over, but it was already clear Netanyahu's ultimatum had unleashed something far greater than he could have anticipated. The people of Burkina Faso had chosen their answer, and it echoed in every chant, every drumbeat, every raised fist. In Jerusalem, the atmosphere inside the Prime Minister's office was tense but resolute. Netanyahu, flanked by his security chiefs, reviewed the latest intelligence on Burkina Faso. A large screen displayed satellite images of Ouagadougou, where protests still filled the streets. His face hardened as he spoke. "This is not just about Traoré," Netanyahu said, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man who had made up his mind. "This is about Africa slipping out of our control. If one soldier in a small Sahelian country can defy us, others will follow. We cannot allow this precedent." Mossad officials laid out a series of options. One involved covert operations, infiltrating Traoré's inner circle, bribing officials, sowing distrust within the military ranks. Another involved cyber warfare, paralyzing government communications, shutting down power grids, disrupting bank systems to create panic. "We can make Burkina Faso collapse from the inside," one official said, pointing at the maps. "No need for open war, just chaos." At the same time, Netanyahu launched a full-scale diplomatic offensive. Calls went out to Washington, Paris, and London. Israeli envoys pressed Western leaders to stand firm, warning that Traoré is aligning with Russia and China, and that allowing him to remain in power would destabilize the entire Sahel. In Europe, sympathetic governments quietly promised support. A leaked EU memo revealed discussions about sanctions on Burkina Faso, a move that would cut off financial lifelines and choke the economy. Meanwhile, Western media outlets began to amplify stories portraying Traoré as a dangerous radical, a puppet of Moscow and a destabilizer of the African continent. The pressure campaign extended to Africa as well. Israel's diplomats reached out to leaders in neighboring countries, offering financial incentives in exchange for silence or cooperation. Some wavered, tempted by promises of aid, but others, fearing the wrath of their own people, rejected Israel's overtures outright. Behind the scenes, the military option was never off the table. Netanyahu met privately with his defense minister, who presented scenarios involving targeted strikes against key assets in Burkina Faso, drones, commandos, even the possibility of a decapitation strike aimed directly at Traoré himself. The Prime Minister listened carefully, his fingers tapping the desk. "We will not announce it," he said finally. "But Traoré must know, If he does not surrender, we will act. The world must understand the cost of defiance. Meanwhile, propaganda machines roared to life. Western television stations aired footage of armed men in Burkina Faso, framing them as militias loyal to Traoré who threaten stability in the region. Talk show hosts warned of an African crisis spilling into Europe. Newspapers ran op-eds urging Western governments to back Netanyahu's stand. Yet for every article condemning Traoré, there were others praising him. In Latin America, newspapers compared him to revolutionary leaders who resisted imperialism. In Asia, commentators describe him as the voice of a new global south. Online, millions mocked Netanyahu's ultimatum with memes of an unshaken Traoré standing tall against the storm. Back in Ouagadougou, Israeli cyber units launched their first digital attack. Suddenly, parts of the capital lost internet service. Banks froze for several hours. Mysterious text messages spread across phones warning, Traoré will bring war. Save yourselves while you can. But the people, already braced for hardship, refused to be broken. Families lit candles during the blackout. Protesters in the streets chanted even louder, "We will not bow. We will not break." Inside his palace, Traoré studied the reports of cyber interference. He turned to his generals. "They want us to panic," he said. "But panic is the weapon of the weak. We will answer their pressure not with fear, but with unity." And so, while Israel tightened the screws, Burkina Faso's resolve only hardened. The 48 hours were more than half gone. And still, the young captain refused to bend. The final day of the ultimatum dawned with a heavy silence over Ouagadougou. The streets, usually bustling with vendors and traffic, were eerily still at sunrise. But by mid-morning, the stillness broke into a tidal wave of humanity. Hundreds of thousands surged into the city squares and avenues. Every street corner, every rooftop, every balcony became part of a living tapestry of resistance. Flags of Burkina Faso whipped in the wind, joined by those of Mali, Niger, Guinea, and beyond. Farmers carried tools as symbols of their labor. Students hoisted books as weapons of knowledge. And soldiers marched in step with ordinary citizens. As the countdown entered its final hours, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto a stage erected in Place de la Révolution. The crowd fell into silence as he looked out over the sea of faces, men and women, young and old, their eyes burning with determination. His voice carried across loudspeakers, raw and powerful. "Brothers and sisters, today the clock runs out on Netanyahu's ultimatum. He demanded that we surrender our independence, that we hand over our dignity. He thought Burkina Faso would tremble. But look around you. Do you see fear?" The crowd erupted. "No." "Do you see surrender?" "No." "What I see is a people unbroken, a people united. And not just Burkina Faso, but Africa itself. Netanyahu thought he gave me 48 hours. Instead, he gave Africa 48 hours to rise. And rise we have." The roar of the crowd shook the very ground. Soldiers saluted. Mothers wept. Children climbed onto their fathers' shoulders, waving flags higher than ever before. As the clock ticked toward the deadline, journalists around the world held their breath. Satellite feeds streamed live images of the square to millions. Analysts speculated about drone strikes, assassinations, economic collapse. The world braced for fire. And then, nothing. No missiles, no soldiers, no thunder of war. The ultimatum expired, and Burkina Faso still stood. Traoré still stood. The people still stood. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu sat with his security chiefs, fury etched across his face. The pressure campaign had failed. Military options remained, but the global tide had turned. Attacking now, in the face of Africa's united defiance, risked igniting a wildfire no one could control. Reluctantly, he gave the order, "Stand down." For now. Across Africa, celebrations exploded. From Bamako to Johannesburg, fireworks lit the skies. Drums beat late into the night. Social media filled with triumphant cries, "Africa did not bow." Historians would later call it a turning point. The day when Africa collectively declared that it would no longer be bullied, divided, or controlled. Burkina Faso, a small nation in the Sahel, had become the symbol of a continent's rebirth. And at the center of it all stood a young captain. his beret tilted, his voice steady, who had dared to say no to the most powerful forces in the world. As night fell over Ouagadougou, Traoré stood once more before his people. The ultimatum had passed, but the struggle was far from over. Raising his fist, he spoke a final vow. Tonight, we have shown the world that Africa is not for sale. But remember, this is not the end. This is only the beginning. The crowd roared, the drums thundered, and the stars above seemed to shine brighter over a continent that, at long last, had begun to awaken.